news. Now, accountability is one of the bedrocks of a representative government. An accountable political system is one where both the government and the elected members of parliament are responsible to their constituents to the highest degree possible. In Nigeria, there's a lack of trust between the citizens and those in government as people don't feel adequately represented, which raises the question of accountability. Recently, a former Minister of Transportation, Chibuike Amechi, accused key political figures who frustrated former President Muhammadu Buhari's electoral reform efforts of pretending to champion the same cause they once sabotaged. Now, this was as former Minister of Education, Dr. Obiageli Ezekwesili, launched a searing critique of Nigeria's electoral and judicial systems, warning that the country's democracy has been reduced to courtroom contests rather than citizens' choices. Well, joining us on the show to discuss how the citizens can hold those in government accountable and also the calls for an electoral system overhaul is Kenny Okolugbo, a political analyst and former consultant on communications and strategy to the President of the Senate, Senator Godswill Akpabio. Good morning and welcome to the program today.
Good morning, happy New Year. Thank you for having me.
Good morning.
In your new studio.
Morning.
My first time here.
Happy New Year to you too. Well, I would have loved to ask you a personal question.
What's the personal question?
You left the team of the Senate President. So did you jump or were you pushed? But that's not why you are here.
I didn't jump.
Okay.
I just decided to move on.
But you didn't serve any notice. We just had that. Okay. But that's not the subject.
Okay.
The major subject is electoral reform.
Yes.
It's not electoral overhaul. It's called electoral reform.
Yes.
And look, a body called the Policy and Legal Advocacy Center and other civil society groups like IAGA Africa and other civil society groups, they've organized plenty of workshops, as it were. The National Assembly committees on electoral reform have also interfaced with these civil society groups, saying the same point that we've been advocating since 1999, that Nigeria's electoral system is a work in progress because after every election you have issues. And so post-2023 general election, all of these groups have been saying we still need electoral reform ahead of 2027. Now, do you think that the National Assembly is just paying lip service and not moving fast enough with regard to electoral reform? And what are those specific areas, process, operation, institution, that you think need to be reformed as priority areas in order for us to have a transparent, credible electoral process in 2027, particularly now that some elements are already violating the law, campaigning before the INEC has blown the whistle?
Yeah, it's very key. But, you know, the funny thing was that in your intro, you talked about the former Minister of Transport who was talking about the Electoral Act that was not signed by the former President, Muhammadu Buhari. I remember that some people like me that were very much against that government cried out when they said because of the 9 days threshold that they were going to have the political parties submit their candidates. That was in 2018. I remember very well. First, it was March 2018, and September 2018, it was rejected twice. And for him to now come to say that there are some political elements who actually stopped that is a great disservice to this country. Having been the Director General of the campaign for Buhari on 2 occasions in 2015 and in 2019, he should have been bold enough to name those who actually stopped the signing of that act. Reform is the fact that the last elections, even Buhari couldn't vote for Tinubu during the elections, or during the primary elections, or vote for Amechi, or vote for any of the aspirants who actually put themselves forward to become the president of this country was quite sad. The Electoral Act was tailored in such a way that even the House of Assembly members, the chairmanship of local governments, could not actually vote in a primary election to select candidates who were supposedly going to be presented in the main election. And so what we had was, we were embarrassed with 3 ad hoc delegates who were chosen, or rather in most cases their names are written, we must call a spade, and presented. And these ad hoc delegates are produced by those who will tailor-guide them into telling them who to vote for during the primary election. And in electoral reform, primary elections matter most than even the main elections. Especially now that, like you have said, a lot of political activities have started. We're looking at May, June to most likely have primaries across all parties, because from the electoral calendar, you must have primaries by May or June if you take the electoral calendar into consideration. And so that electoral act that has to be reformed or has to be rejigged has to take into consideration those pitfalls that happened during the 2023 elections, especially during the primary elections, where we can have a genuine process of electing delegates who will elect the candidates who will contest these elections. And that's why when you talk of having an extra seat for women, the disadvantages also mainly comes from the primary elections, if you ask my opinion.
When you're speaking on issues surrounding delegates, I mean, this is a controversial issue every single electoral cycle, but it still plays out. And that chimes into the other theme that you're to discuss on, which is accountability. Yes. Once our office holders, once they are elected and once they're there, there's immunity in every sense of the word. I don't mean from legal proceedings, but I mean from being accountable to the electorate. And it seems that we are helpless as people. We are just at the mercy of what those in power decide to do. And if you dare question them, especially if it's the presidency, they'll tell you that, it's a cabal around the president. How do we move forward from this type of politics? Because some people will say, we need to strengthen our institutions. We repeat this over and over. However, the same people who are supposed to strengthen the institutions are those who will say that, it's not us, it's the cabal. Is this a political culture we should just accept?
No, I think I could totally disagree with that accepting that political culture. I was watching your program yesterday, and I can't remember who the person was now. I think it was the former National Secretary of the Alliance of Democracy, and he was criticizing, for example, the trial of the Bauchi State Commissioner for finance, for alleged terrorism, financing terrorism. And I was taken aback, because I remember, if you were talking about accountability, the judge, Justice Nwite, refused him bail. And he's only a judge. I mean, Dr. Ruben Abati is here, he's a lawyer, he knows what proof of evidence is. When a judge sees the proof of evidence, he must have seen that the prima facie case has been established. And for him to say, I will not give bail to this man on $9.7 million, it means there are certain factors that he needs to look into. That is why he has said, this is not the normal case that I can give bail. And when somebody comes and criticizes the institution for putting up such a case, it leaves a lot to be desired. If you look at the history of accountability, if you look at the Murtala Mohammed administration, you remember only 2 governors were not indicted, Mobolaji Johnson and Wole Rotimi, out of the 12 governors. And even on the panel, there were only 2 ministers were not indicted, Mungunu and Shagari. Even though someone like Papa Clark said in his own case he was being maligned for having taken the positions he took, having had somebody like Obasanjo and Murtala as colleagues in the cabinet. But all the things that were seized from those people were returned back in 1986. There was no trial. And even when the Kolade panel came after Obasanjo, there was no real trial. So I think the bottom line of this case is, I'll take a cue from what you said, and I said it on the sister station, Dr. Abati, is that there must be a special court for corruption trial to bring people accountable. Because, you see, most of the cases you talk about and accountability we talk about is the judiciary that should actually be on trial. I talked about a case I have, for example, an interlocutory appeal has been on since 2013. And it has not been decided, not even the final appeal. And so when you're talking about these institutions, ICPC, for example, in 2020, also indicted Bala Mohammed for having acquired the General School somewhere in Wuye when he was a minister, but couldn't put him on trial because he had become governor. That case is pending. The Abia State governor, for example, former governor Theodore Oji, was charged for a case for 2011. You can imagine, 2011 to 2015. He was only charged in February. Look at the long time the investigation took. For example, someone sent me an inbox on my at Ken Okolugbo and said, "Oh Ken, I don't like the way you defend the fight against corruption on this administration." But why I do that, because I look at the facts that are before us in terms of comparison with the Buhari administration. And I'm happy now a lot of the Buhari ministers are being called to trial, because then when we were in the opposition and we're talking about these things, it was like we were crying foul. And so the major reason of accountability is that you have to use people as critical example. If you look at it, it was only Darie and Anyame, the former governor of Plateau and the former governor of Taraba, that has been actually held to book in the series of all the trials of politically exposed people.
But they'll tell you they're being politically persecuted for being opposition.
And that is where I come in terms of blackmail. Because when you blackmail the institutions, for example, you make it difficult for them to move forward. And it becomes difficult. For example, Malami has been the chief law officer of this country for 8 years. 8 good years. You can't tell a senior advocate of Nigeria, in the person of Malami, what the law says. But there are alleged infractions against him. And what he says is that there is a report which was not gazetted, and he's trying to use that as a weapon instead of defending himself against those allegations that have now been filed in court. So I think basically the truth about it is that there must be a special court established. If you don't establish a special court, the accountability issue in this country will continue, because people have to fill the access form. Don't forget, I was a commissioner. Before I was sworn in, I filled my asset declaration form. And after I left, I filled my asset declaration form. And one of the things that are done by these ICPC, EFCC, is the first thing they tell you to do is to fill your asset declaration form, because they want to see what you have acquired while you're in office. But people don't take it seriously because it's not being enforced.
Okay, so how can we talk about election accountability when what transpired that constituted a technical glitch in the presidential election, where the server system stopped, has not been unraveled till date? There were 2 elections on that day.
Yes.
Senate and House of Rep and presidential. Senate and House of Rep, no technical glitch. Only presidential technical glitch happened. And we saw the outcomes of those elections. Until today, we have not gone a fact-finding mission of what transpired. Because with computer systems, there are trails. If something happened, you will see a trail of what constitutes that thing. Till today, INEC has not revealed that trail. Till today, we don't know what's transpired. They've posited every excuse in the book, but we've not seen empiricals. So how do we have election accountability when we have not sorted out what made technical glitch happen only in the presidential election in 2023?
Well, that was a thumbs down on INEC, whether you like it or not, on the issue of the electoral glitch. And I thought before the last INEC chairman left office, it was an issue he was going to deal with. But unfortunately, the only way we can deal with this technical glitch is to actually allow a legislation that can now make it a law in our Electoral Act for electronic transmission of results to be part of the process, not just the card reader. Remember initially when Jonathan introduced the card reader, it was a process that saw accreditation coming in a way that people were not able to just go vote without having had their voter's card confirmed. And they said the card reader was not part of the law. Now you must have the card reader and electronic transmission of results as part of the Electoral Act. Then this glitch would not have been able to be explained, because by the time you transmit the electoral results from the polling unit, that's the format the polling unit is transmitted, it becomes very difficult for you to change the figures at the collation center. So I must agree with you that technical glitch was a thumbs down on the last elections, but it didn't stop the Supreme Court from confirming the elections, because there was no law backing it. So the only way we can go around this technical glitch that happened the last time is to find a law that says we must electronically transmit our results.
Public accountability for a contentious election like that, where you now have a specific use case of the fact that 2 elections happened on one day, only one, and the most pivotal one had a technical glitch. Do you think INEC should have actually done a report of, their back end, or open it up to independent investigation?
What I thought they were going to do was to allow that back end, because the back end there was a back end report. But don't forget that there was calculations that were done from Form EC8A up to Form EC8C And that was what they used. They used manual calculation, which a couple of people frowned at because they said manual calculation could have been tampered with.
Yeah,
do you understand? And that it defeats, that's exactly what it is. So I agree with you on that aspect.
The question I started with. This discussion has been going this way, that way. We talked about electoral reform. I need you to speak to the urgency of reform and to identify what to you will seem to be the specific priorities. Urgency, so that we don't have the kind of situation we had during President Buhari's first term as a civilian president, when they said, oh, there was no time again to look at the reforms. That was before, he got his second term. So the urgency of it. And then in terms of priorities, there are many issues on the table. INEC operations, women representation, the use of technology, the reporting system within INEC, a whole scope of things, the integrity of the politicians and the political process, how to deal with electoral offenses. But I don't want to identify my own priorities for you. What do you think is urgent, and how urgent should the process be? And what should the National Assembly do?
And that was why I talked about the 2018 issue. I spoke about it, that the 9 days issue was cured. After the 9 days issue was cured in 2022 of saying that there will be no time to take on those who have been nominated during a period of primaries. You must agree that why I harped on primaries is that is the bane of the elections. Most issues come from primaries. We have pre-election matters dragging up to even when the elections have taken place. And we have a window. They've tried to amend the constitution in such a way that there's a timeline, 30 days for pre-election matters, 60 days for the Court of Appeal, for the ones that stop at the Court of Appeal, which is the House of Reps and the House of Assembly. Then the governorship gets to the Supreme Court. It is a 90 days window. But the main electoral reform that should come from the National Assembly has to do with the fact that there should be eternal democracy that is championed by political parties who will not anoint candidates, but allow a process where candidates emerge during pre-election and post-election. It will now become impossible to have the kind of litigations we have. Now, if you go back to the Wise report, which is where you're going to take me, I didn't want to talk about it because it's going to take us a whole lot here. The Wise report, first of all, said talked about the way you are going to appoint the INEC chairman, the independent nature of appointing INEC chairman, the fact that they're trying to tailor the elections for one day, that is presidential, governorship, National Assembly, because all the elections can take place in one day, so it will not be staggered and will not have to spend so much resources. But this is a long process that it will take a long period. And you see, we're almost falling in the same, like you rightly said, in the same trap that we have always fallen into. It's always almost a crash program because primaries, like I said, most likely will start in May, June. And so if this the National Assembly is not going to resume until the 27th of January. And so that gives them just February and March to do anything about the Electoral Act. So the timeline has to be such that they have to carry along all these reforms and make it impossible for you to have a process where people are just going to be anointed as candidates, where there will be no electronic transmission of results, where there will be no issue of where card readers will insist on the fact that that will be used for accreditation. If these three things are done, I think we can have elections in 2027 that will not be like the ones in 2023.
Okay, thank you very much, Kenny Okolugbo, for joining us on The Morning Show.